Welcome to another episode of Silicon Bites, and once again I'm on the road, so excuse me for the background noise. This episode is about regime change. Regime change, Nuland, hold my beer. It seems the US is back in the game of seeking to change regimes, whether that's through democratic means or otherwise. Before we get into it, thank you to everybody who's supporting various campaigns we've got on the go. Buying trucks for Ukraine is a campaign we are relaunching again to get more 4x4s pickups to get sent to Ukraine for conversion to be battle ready. Thank you to everyone who's also supporting my emergency campaign. Thank you to everybody also who's supporting my last minute campaign to raise some funds to help me go and accompany an aid convoy to Ukraine for a week, where we're going to be doing some filming. We're going to be doing a daily video diary, which will end up on the channel. We're going to hope to try and publish it just with 1 or 2 days sort of delay. That will be, I think, an extraordinary experience, and we hope to gather some unique footage and interviews along the way from that one. So thank you to everyone who is supporting that. Of course, there are links to that in the description of the video. Let's get into the topic for today. There is, of course, desire in Ukraine for a time when elections can be held in a safe and inclusive fashion. There is massive support for a reassertion of democratic process because, of course, Ukraine has a vibrant and combative democratic culture and a penchant for boisterous dialogue. But most people believe now is not the time to unleash these pent-up political forces. The risk of division is something that Putin could ruthlessly exploit to gain advantage. But as the so-called peace talks gain momentum, the debate over Ukraine's elections and future leadership intensifies. But this pressure is a matter for Ukrainians and their democratic agency, an expression in theirs and their system alone. The trouble is that much of the pressure to speed up the process of having elections is coming from the outside. It's coming from the Russians and it's coming from the American sides. And those questioning the legitimacy of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are largely external to the country. People who have no vote in the process, no skin in the game, and are not citizens of Ukraine. But this coercive pressure is having the opposite effect, that is, solidifying the position of Zelensky's approval ratings. They've been under pressure for many months due to military setbacks, internal disputes, and questions over governance. But they've bounced back following the debacle in the Oval Office. Recent polling shows a sharp rise in his ratings, and the cause is the rift with the United States, which Ukraine did not seek, but which seems inevitable when dealing with Trump and his entourage, who seem to be imbibing unreasonable quantities of Kremlin talking points. My fear is that even if Trump is not actively working to an agenda designed in the Kremlin, and the evidence certainly points to this way, nonetheless his attention span is limited, his patience is finite, and his appreciation for complex negotiations and the nuances of diplomacy is practically zero. He will get frustrated with the drawn-out process, and he will look around for a scapegoat when things don't go his way and things don't go quickly. Trump will cast Zelensky as the obstacle to his genius peace plan, and he'll be aided and abetted to that conclusion by a manipulative Vladimir Putin, a trained KGB dissembler and manipulator. So what's the game plan? Try to replace Zelensky with a president more amenable to the rapprochement between Washington and Moscow? In a word, someone willing to betray their country's interests, dilute its justifiable demands for justice, restitution, and sovereignty? One of the wilder allegations is that Trump Jr., Witkoff, and Tucker Carlson are involved in secret talks with Zelensky's rivals. This was reported in Politico and covered in the Kyiv Independent. Politico reported on March 18th that Trump's son, Donald Jr., news host Tucker Carlson, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and special envoy Steve Witkoff were involved in back-channel talks with Zelensky's political rivals, citing undisclosed sources. Let's pause for a minute to judge the insanity of this. The scenario is more reminiscent of a scene in the Godfather movie than reality, treating geopolitics as if it's a crooked New York real estate deal backed by the Cosa Nostra. If true, it's an appalling reflection of the lack of political judgment of Poroshenko and Tymoshenko, their willingness to meet such grifters, buffoons and sharks, no matter what was discussed, should exclude them from serious politics in Ukraine, let alone a path to the highest office of a nation at war with Russia. Carlson, at least, is fully aligned with Kremlin narratives, propagandistic tropes, and weaponized lies. He has shilled for the Kremlin for years, including a propaganda tour of Moscow and an obsequious audience with the Tsar himself, Putin. I can't bring myself to call it an interview or a conversation. The Trump administration's displeasure with Zelensky has been clear for some time, possibly dating back to his refusal to dig up dirt on the Bidens during Trump's first term in office, but which exploded into the open during the Oval Office debacle. Politico reported on March 6th that members of Trump's team led secret discussions with ex-President Pyotr Poroshenko's allies and former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. One theory is this was an attempt to make Zelensky more compliant and show that the US has other potential partners in Ukraine. But in the context of normal political discourse and conduct, this looks very underhand and undemocratic, akin to a form of coercion or even a soft coup. Witkoff is the only person who holds an official position in Trump's team, but is a real estate developer and chum of Trump's that has no background in geopolitics, knowledge of the region, and likely little grounding in the history of Ukraine or Russia. Carlson is, of course, a controversial far-right media host who promotes anti-Ukrainian narratives and interviewed Putin, as I said, and also Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Trump Jr., the US President's eldest son and executive vice president of the Trump Organization, has also repeatedly lashed out against US support for Kyiv on social media and repeated the worst Kremlin narratives. Kushner is a businessman and investor who served as Trump's advisor during his first administration and is married to the president's daughter, Ivanka Trump. Are US officials convinced that Zelensky would lose elections if they were held today, despite numerous polls saying otherwise? Well, Politico sources think that they are. But imagine the disappointment in the US if, by helping to remove Zelensky from office, they just get more Zelensky with a confirmed mandate to speak for Ukraine and to negotiate, of course. Trump has repeatedly called for elections in Ukraine and called Zelensky a dictator without elections, a statement that echoes the Kremlin's propaganda about Zelensky's supposed illegitimacy. The Ukrainian constitution does not permit elections under martial law, which was instituted at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Recent opinion polls say 44% of Ukrainians would vote for Zelensky in the first round, the highest number of all potential candidates, followed by ex-commander-in-chief Valery Zaluzhny with 21%, Poroshenko with 10%, and Tymoshenko with 6%. Both Poroshenko and Tymoshenko acknowledged some public contacts with foreign partners, including the US, but they rejected calls for holding elections during the war. It will be no use for Ukraine to have a political martyr as a president or be forced to hold an early yet chaotic and divisive election. Ukraine has survived previous crises through defiance, not accommodation with bullies. But now it seems that Trump will be able to marshal extraordinary pressure to coerce Ukraine to accept one after another of Putin's conditions. This pressure will likely include, but not be limited to, cutting off aid again, cutting off intelligence again, supporting Russia overtly and covertly with intel and data to give them battlefield advantage, lifting sanctions on Russia, again overtly, or simply by turning a blind eye. Lifting secondary sanctions on China and others who are willing to trade with Russia. Again, this can be done overtly or covertly. Turn a blind eye to the export of machine tools and weapon components. Block European actions against the Grey Fleet breaking the oil price cap sanctions. There are signs that this is already happening. Pressure allies in Europe and the UK to cut off aid and intelligence support to Ukraine. Cut off all civilian aid that helps the Ukrainian government to function. Negotiate conditions of a peace that favour Russia and weaken Ukrainian resistance. Fail to provide a backstop for European peacekeepers to deploy to Ukraine. Withhold components and maintenance for advanced US weapons provided to Europe. Scale up trade tariffs and the trade war against all countries that seek to assist Ukraine. Again, there are some signs of this happening as well. Propose economically rapacious schemes to take over strategic Ukrainian industries, such as the minerals deal, such as the nuclear industry as well. Proposals for the US to asset strip Ukraine in return for illusory security guarantees. Well, that's the list I could come up with. I'm sure the audience of this channel can come up with many more to add to it. Zelensky is not merely posturing, but actively resisting US pressure to accept terms that would weaken Ukraine's position. This game of verbal and political abuse has only just begun though. If you are already feeling bruised, abused and traumatized, especially following the debacle in the Oval Office, then buckle up for months of this psychological battering of Ukraine into accepting Putin's terms of capitulation. This will not be over anytime soon. But this resistance to Trump's bullying and unprecedented treatment of a foreign leader has transformed Zelensky from a leader facing difficult re-election prospects into a figure once again seen as indispensable to Ukraine's security and independence, despite his flaws and many mistakes that he's made in wartime. Make no mistake, Trump wants Zelensky gone because he is an impediment to Trump's perfect peace and a barrier to receive the undiluted adoration of his friend Vladimir Putin. That same Putin that kept Trump and his envoy Witkoff earlier in the week waiting for hours to join appointed calls and meetings. That same Putin that clearly talked of Trump in derisive and mocking terms to an audience of Russian oligarchs and lackeys. But the idea Washington could appoint or even cajole into power a pro-American successor to Zelensky shows a woeful lack of misunderstanding of Ukraine's political landscape and indeed Ukrainian history as well. Russia has repeatedly underestimated Ukraine and continues to do so, and Trump is taking his cue from the Russians and not from any evidence-based reality. It seems that an unholy mix of advisors and fanatics from Trump's circle have been colluding with Poroshenko and Tymoshenko to create a coalition to oppose Zelensky. This fantasy politics seems to conveniently forget what Ukrainians do when external forces seek to impose solutions upon them. Remember the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity? Trump would barely comprehend this anyway, as he has a dignity bypass. The most likely contender to collude in such a political scheme is Yulia Tymoshenko, but her appeal is marginal at best, and she never won an election in Ukraine. If Washington backed her, then her support would likely erode still further. The same goes with Poroshenko, who is not held in the same disdain and distrust as Tymoshenko, but whose barely concealed eagerness to embrace power again will suffer if he is seen to collude with outside forces, especially if it undermines Ukraine and Ukrainian security. Poroshenko is a fixture of Ukrainian politics, but his time in office left deep divisions and whose chances of winning the presidency are incredibly slim. But if Washington forced an election, then they are most likely to get more Zelensky. And if he is somehow persuaded not to stand, or even prevented from standing in some way, then the most likely choice would be General Zaluzhny instead. This is surely a candidate that neither the Kremlin nor the White House would want, as he could prove to be an even greater stumbling block to their plans and to weaken Ukrainian resolve to stand for their values and sovereignty. He would not give in to Moscow narratives and pressure from Trump. The idea Zaluzhny could become a pro-American candidate is absolutely absurd, as his primary allegiance is to Ukrainian military, not any foreign political agenda. He's also canny enough to understand that any collusion with the US or other external forces would be seen with suspicion and disdain by voters in general, but especially by people in the army. In this sense, association with Trump would be like kryptonite for any Ukrainian political super candidate. The US can attempt to undermine and even remove Zelensky, but it's unlikely whoever replaces him would alter the negotiating stance of the country or surrender more positions than the incumbent in that role to the Kremlin's demands. This is something rarely commented upon, but which really stands out. Both Trump and Putin seem to think Zelensky can unilaterally make decisions of substantial importance without consultation with ministers and parliament. This is what happened during the first coercive attempts to get him to sign the mineral deal extortion. He has no legal mandate to sign such documents without ratification, yet Trump assumes he has the same impunity towards the law that Trump himself does, and Putin assumes Zelensky is a puppet of the American regime and will do anything the US command him to do. Well, they are both so very wrong in different ways. If a Ukrainian leader conceded to Russian demands, history shows that he wouldn't last long. Ukraine has a well-established tradition of overthrowing leaders who serve Russian interests. The idea the war in Ukraine can be resolved by reshuffling its leadership is naive, and it could also be a recipe for chaos. But attempts to sideline Zelensky and label him as an obstacle to negotiations have actually strengthened his position. Trump wants Zelensky out of the way, but how far will he go to make this happen? The US presidential administration is giving every sign of being captured by Putin at this stage. Trump is doing Putin's dirty work for him, one by one pronouncing Putin's demands that would lead to a weaker Ukraine and to eventual capitulation, at the same time repeating the propagandistic slogans and myths whispered into Trump's ears and those of his minions. After all, what is the logic behind ousting Zelensky? It can't be stability and economic growth, because the chaos of an imposed wartime election would deliver neither of these. Aligning with candidates that would likely mark a return to oligarchic influence and increased corruption is also not a recipe for future economic prosperity. Ukraine has been through that, and no one is currently fighting in trenches for a return to the past, the Ukraine of a decade ago. Literally no one wants that. The Trump administration appears to have no clue what they are doing with Ukraine and no clue on how to end the war or even how to force Putin to agree a ceasefire. The policy quite literally appears to be to give Putin whatever he wants and label every setback as a success, every insult as a triumph, and to repeat every Russian lie and excuse that is handed to them. In their frustration, Trump may be tempted to engage in an attempted regime change in Kyiv, which would put Nuland to shame. It would also likely end in abject failure, like so many of Trump's business ventures. But would Russia be there to bail him out once again? Eventually, Ukraine will have to say no to the emperor with no clothes. Eventually, Ukraine's allies will have to take a stand and in their turn say no to Trump. That moment, which will separate the goats from the sheep, is rapidly approaching.